Well, everyone, we get to finally talk about the iPhone 4S and see how this particular phone holds up in 2025. Now, number one, the biggest thing I can tell you is that I pretty much think that this phone is not really worth buying anymore, but there might be some people out there who still would consider buying this type of phone, and we'll explain that a little bit later throughout this video. First things first though, if you do want to pick up some phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 4S, this iPhone originally came out back in 2011, and this was actually one of the last 3.5-inch phones that we actually ended up getting. Since this point, this has pretty much been the last small-sized iPhone Apple has made from this particular size, which has always been kind of interesting. So with the way this particular phone looks, it's a 3.5-inch IPS LCD panel. At that time, this was one of those types of, panels and types of displays that Apple made that was basically a retina display. So that was always something that was really cool that they kind of threw in here. So basically the pixels are so good on the display that you can't even discern them. And it still looks pretty good, but keep in mind this is a fairly small phone even in today's standards. And even back in 2011, it was kind of a small display and very big bezels on the top and bottom. It's almost like the screen itself is like half the amount of bezel. And then there's like half the amount of bezel that's just the bezel. So it's kind of crazy in and of itself. Now you are getting that home button at the very front too, which as I mentioned before is pretty outdated. A lot of people have moved on from these types of home buttons. But that's kind of another thing that's going on in this particular phone as well. So when you take a look at it from the exterior, I definitely will tell you this type of device, in my personal opinion, still looks fairly good for the most part. Like I generally don't have like too many things to kind of worry about here from like that particular situation. But as I mentioned, there might be some other areas where this type of phone may not hold up that best. On the bottom, you're getting that original 30-pin connector on this phone too. So that right there is another one of those things to keep in mind. This type of phone, this type of device is going to be a little bit outdated even from that side. We have switched the charging port twice on iPhones since this phone has came out. This was also the last iPhone to have a 30-pin connector, I believe, because after this, we ended up getting the iPhone 5 that brought Lightning. You're also getting the headphone jack inside of this phone too. So it is interesting when I go ahead and take a look at this phone, it does actually have a lot of stuff going on with it, right? This is one of those types of phones that in my personal opinion looks pretty good. I think it still feels pretty good on the, around the phone too. And the fact that it does have a headphone jack, it was only like 6 or 5 years after this phone came out that Apple ended up removing the headphone jack in all their phones. So that right there's like another funny thing to kind of keep in mind there as well. Beyond that though, that's kind of what we're kind of seeing when it comes down to this type of device. From the bottom and the sides and the front, on the back side, this iPhone was giving you this glass back, which even back in 2011, that was a really nice thing to have. You have to remember that for iPhones, and for a lot of phones back around that time, a lot of phones were basically giving you like, plastic bags, but they were removable. Instead of our iPhone 4S, the fact that we were getting this type of like glass back made this phone feel so premium. Say what you want about iPhones, but they always feel so premium for the most part. And that was easily one of the best things going on for this type of device at that moment. You're also getting that single camera setup. And that's kind of it when it comes down to the outside of this phone. But there are a lot of things missing out on this phone that compared to nowadays would probably make you feel quite left out, or seeing how many improvements we've made since this phone's initial release. Number one, this phone is definitely going to be a little bit outdated when it does kind of come down to its build quality. It still feels fairly premium, but like I said, with that device panel looking the way it does, that is kind of a little bit of an outdated type of display for the most part. So that is kind of one of those big things to keep in mind there. If you're planning on going through and getting a phone, you're definitely going to feel like you're going to be getting a device that definitely feels a little bit outdated when it comes down to it, especially with that panel and with everything else around it. Now, on top of that, no USB Type-C. That's another very big downside for this type of phone too. So that right there is like a pretty big turnoff. And there's no IP certification on this phone, no OLED display, no wireless charging on this phone either. There are a lot of random things that are going on with this phone that definitely show its age. So if you thought this phone was still a really good phone that held up in that side, that is definitely not the case. The only area where this phone is like kind of decent in is probably price tag. This phone is substantially cheaper than a lot of the competition. As you could probably imagine, this phone costs maybe like $30 or $20 in the used market. So there's also that thing you can kind of keep in mind there. But even with that being said, I still don't think this phone is necessarily a good value in my personal opinion either. Now, when it does kind of come down to the camera side, this phone was giving you that 8 megapixel standard camera on the back side and a VGA camera on the front. Now that VGA camera on the front really is not that good. As you can imagine, it is a very lackluster type of lens. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're planning on getting a phone like this. It's definitely going to start showing its age a little bit. So just kind of want to make sure that you are aware of that, because this phone's camera really isn't that good. And even for phones back then, you also have to remember, like, this type of device was giving you that type of stranger type of experience in a way, because it just really wasn't that good. But back then, for like back in 2000 and, when this phone originally came out, 2011 standards, I'm sure it actually wasn't that bad. So that is kind of one of those funny things to kind of keep in mind there as well. Now, on top of that, when it comes down to probably the worst area of this phone, is probably software longevity. This phone is no longer supported with software anymore, and that is kind of the biggest, I guess, downside of buying this phone, even more so than probably anything else. If you're getting a phone, as long as it's still kind of supported with software, you're probably going to be okay. Unfortunately, this phone isn't really supported with software in any capacity. So because of that, it just doesn't make any sense to go and buy this phone. Not only is it no longer supported with software, it hasn't been supported with software for years now, for like tons and tons of years. So what exactly would be the point of buying this type of phone? There's just so many other phones out there to go and buy, and it just doesn't really make any sense to go and buy this type of phone, in my personal opinion. So, if you're going to go buy a device in the used market or anything like that, buy a phone that's still supported with software, especially even from the battery life standpoint. Like, the battery life for this phone also really isn't that good anymore either. So because of that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to go and buy these types of phones. It makes a lot more sense to go and buy other devices that are still supported with software. This one just doesn't make a lot of sense to go and buy, in my personal opinion, either, because of the software experience. And even from the performance side, this phone was basically giving you the Apple A5 chip inside of it with 512 megabytes of RAM. So you can kind of imagine from that side too, this phone's performance really is not that good at all. There's just not that big of a point of buying a phone like this anymore. There are substantially better phones to go and buy. So once again, I would just not recommend buying this phone from a performance side. But I do remember when this phone initially came out, and the performance of this phone was very decent. It was one of the best performing phones you can buy in that year. And it's always so interesting to kind of take a look at those things, because clearly I wouldn't really recommend buying this phone anymore. But if you are planning on buying this phone in the future, or if you were buying this phone back then, some people would have probably been claiming that this was probably one of the better performing phones of that year. So that in and of itself is something else really interesting going on here as well. So overall, to kind of sum up this whole entire video, I definitely will tell you, I think the iPhone 4S brought a lot of stuff to the table. It brought Siri and all those things, but I just don't think anybody should be buying this type of phone anymore. It just is outdated. It's very, very old. But if you want to buy it as a collector's item, that might not be a bad option. If you can find one in relatively good condition, if you can find one that probably still has the box and other accessories, you might be able to go ahead and get one that's probably still going to be able to give you a decent experience in some ways. But beyond that, it's not worth using. I would much rather recommend an iPhone 11 or above, an iPhone 11 Pro or above, especially an iPhone 13. Those ones would be really good. But the iPhone 4S, definitely not worth buying anymore at all. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hope I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.